Hello, hello, hello. Hope everybody is having a wonderful evening. Wanted to try and get back in again this evening, as I was mentioning this morning. And we'll do another conversation this evening on European ancestry and different ancestors. Somebody's messaging me something weird. I don't know what it is. I hope everybody's having a wonderful day. We're just going to go ahead and continue our conversation tonight on European ancestors. And probably just go for a couple of hours because I'm already kind of getting tired, and it's been kind of a busy couple of weeks, and I get a little bit overstimulated and over just world shit, right? So it becomes a little bit hard for me. So I'll probably only go for a couple of hours tonight. I do intend to be on a little bit more in the next couple of weeks, just as I realize that due to my circumstances of everything been going on in my life, I haven't really been on very much during the last couple of weeks. And so I'd like to be on a little bit more. Hey, Atira, it's good to see you. And try and make sure that I'm getting a little bit more going on, right? And being active. I am, of course, still working on a few other projects that I've got going on, and I'll continue to work on those few other projects, of course. But this is a subject on a topic of conversation that's asked for quite frequently. So I want to make sure that we're getting some information on it, and so that we can get some depth on it. And so I wanted to make sure, like I said, I did come in this afternoon and talk for a couple of hours, but I wanted to make sure I got in again this evening and was able to talk for a couple of hours and get information out and to reach more people. I know that so many different people have different schedules. And so trying to make sure that I'm reaching everybody's different schedule. I want to make sure that I can try and come in. And I haven't been in the evenings a lot lately, just because by this time of day, my brain kind of goes, and sometimes it's hard for me to to be able to function enough to be able to hold a conversation or to be able to actually give information, because my brain has decided it's no longer viable by 8 o'clock at night. And so I haven't been in the evening as much as possible, and I'm trying to go ahead and be in the evening a little bit more, just because I do realize that for many people this time frame is their best time frame. Whether it's having to do with the fact that they are needing they're working during the day, or maybe they're in a different part of the world. And so I do realize that nighttime can be a very good time frame for a lot of people. And I do want to try and get in during my nighttime to hit that time frame for a lot of people. Today, we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the early Europeans and how people are moving into Europe at the time, and what we're seeing from the people moving into Europe at the time, and how the way that this movement tells us things, and what the belongings and the artifacts that we find from these time periods tell us about these people. Most of these people are ancestors of the Europeans that are in the areas that they're in today, right? And this is because a lot of times cultures will change, but the genetics won't change, right? A lot of times the way a culture will shift and change and advance and move around in its cultural processes will change, yet they're not actually moving physical space as much, right? They're staying within a specific physical space. Even if we're talking migratory cultures, they still tend to stay within a specific migratory pattern in a specific migratory space. And so it's important when we're looking at ancestry, and when we're looking at reconnection, and we're looking at animism, and we're looking at different ways to actually try and grab that thought process for ourselves, and try and a lot of people are trying to reconnect without appropriating other people's culture. A lot of people are just trying to reconnect in a positive way, and all of those different things. It's important when we're doing those things that we go ahead and look as far back as we possibly can and find as much information as we possibly can. The picture is of a Gravachian cultured person, or a person from the Gravachian culture, which is about 40 to 30,000 years ago in Western Eurasia. Uh, we're looking at France, the Iberian Peninsula, pretty much all the way up into the middle part of Western Eurasia from about 40 to 30,000 years ago. And so this is a Gravachian. You might recognize on this Gravachian person I wonder it will, yeah. You might recognize on this Gravachian person the headdress that's on this Gravachian, right? The headdress that's on this Gravachian has um, we see this in the Venus of Bullendorf. One second, I accidentally deleted that thing and I didn't want to delete that thing. I want you guys to all be able to find me over on YouTube if you need to. But I noticed that it was like right in his face, and I don't want to write in his face. Um, and so the Gravachian culture is one of the earlier cultures that we see within Western Eurasia. Um, it's important to note that when we talk about things like the Gravachian culture or and I'm going to pronounce this wrong like the first three times I do it, and then I might get it right. The Eurasian culture that predates the Gravachian culture, and the Solutrean culture that comes after the Gravachian culture. It's important to note that these aren't actually different genetic groups of people, that they are just shifts in cultural thought processes. And that the names that we give them aren't necessarily what they would have called themselves. I doubt that they're back there calling themselves Gravachian. It is names that we, as archaeologists or anthropologists or scientists today studying these ancient cultures, have given them based a lot of times on the area that we find the first finds having to do with them in, sometimes based on thought processes of that we have behind the artifacts that we find. It is definitely, though, not something that they are calling themselves. It's not definitely how they're identifying with themselves. Um, so those are some things that I want to make sure that we know as we go in. You might recognize, though, on this person the headdress, and this is kind of an interpretation that we have for the headdress that we see on the Venus of Bullendorf, which is that kind of chunky little goddess that most people know of. That has, like, she doesn't really have so much facial features, but on her head she seems to have this skull cap of shells or something like that, and she is a very curvaceous, very beautiful goddess. We see that there are a couple of other Venuses from this time frame that seem to have this kind of headdress, right? And so there is some thought process that this headdress might actually have significance, like might be a rank, might be a denotion of occupation for people, right? Yes. And that's how we name most people. Clovis is absolutely named for the nearby town. When we look at like Neanderthal, Neanderthal is named. Tal means valley, and Neander Valley is why we named Neanderthal, because we found Neanderthal first in Neander Valley. Um, Denisovan comes from Denisova Cave. Homo naledi comes from the Rising Star Cave of South Africa, and Naledi is star. Homo florensis comes from Flores Island in Indonesia. When we are looking at many different old cultures or ancient peoples that might not be Homo sapien, we tend to name them after where we find them. We didn't name Homo erectus like that or Homo habilis like that, and there are some other Homo species that we didn't name like that. But things like Homo heidelbergensis is because the first find of Homo heidelbergensis is in Heidelberg, right? Oh, right. Oh, that's a beautiful, beautiful documentary. I love that documentary. Um, you are so early up, Sleepy. This is very early for you. Um, so when we're looking at many of these other species, many of these ancient cultures, they are definitely uh, when was I not, Dab? When we look at many of these other different species that predate us or that we lived alongside of, or when we're looking at many of the cultures that predate us, those cultures are definitely named after something that we personally associated with them, right? Yeah, and it is. It's all prehistory. So we don't actually have stories that we have that document them, right? Like history is written stories. So anything that is historical or within history is something that starts after the advent of writing that we think of today. Recently, we've discovered that there's evidence that there's writing in caves like 27,000 years ago by Homo sapien. There is some evidence that Neanderthal may have had some form of symbol system of a writing system for like documentation on cave walls as well. And in the Rising Star Cave series, the in that um, sorry, in that documentary, you'll see that within that documentary, the artwork on the walls sometimes looks a little bit like runic writing, right? So there is possibility we'll see if there is writing associated with there, right? So, as we're looking at different groups, we need to understand that prehistory is anything prior to our understanding of when writing starts. And most people will tell you that the start of writing is cuneiform, yet we actually see that writing actually predates cuneiform. We see that hieroglyphs predate cuneiform, and hieroglyphs go back roughly like 6,000 years. The oldest hieroglyph is in Egypt is the cartouche of King Scorpion that is found on a wall in a pass in Egypt in Kemet. And so we're seeing that there's a lot of knowledge that predates writing out there that we're not really getting. And this is what we call prehistory because it's not written down in history as written story. My thoughts on Gobekli Tepe. I love what is coming out of Gobekli Tepe and the new Tepe that they just found last year. Kariam Tepe has a lot of really interesting stuff going on within it. Did you see like they have a statue of a man holding his genitalia that they found in the new Tepe? I find the Tepes to be really cool. My thought process with the Tepes is that they are so some people think that they're early worship centers. I think that they're more early gather centers, more centers where people are coming to kind of gather. Maybe you're wintering in this, space time. Just different. There's a few different ways that we could have been using the tepes that would have worked very well for us. There's no evidence that we were actually living long term in the tepes so far, but that doesn't mean that there won't come evidence that we were living long term in the tepes. The tepes actually start roughly around the same time that we see our first actual agriculture based cities start in relatively close proximity. So, like our first agricultural based city is in Jordan at 9,000 years ago, which is like only a thousand years past or a thousand years after Gobekli Tepe, right? So there's a couple of different thought processes of what they could be. Um, the dating techniques that we're using currently, for the most part, are pretty accurate. So I do think that the current dating for the Tepes is probably relatively accurate. That doesn't mean that we won't find stuff that maybe dates it a little bit earlier or maybe adjusts it, right? Um, Yet, we'll see as time moves along, especially with the newer Tepe that we've just found, right? It might actually predate the other one. I don't think so. I don't think so, Jake. I don't think that we have. So that doesn't mean. So pictographs are writing as well, right? So, we know that many indigenous nations within North America, specifically, actually have different writing systems, but their writing systems are more of a pictographic writing system. So we know of like calendars that are done through pictographic writing and stuff like that. We like to think that only the alphabet is writing, only something that works within our idea of an alphabet. An alphabet is just one form of writing system. We actually, hieroglyphs means a writing system that has multiple meanings for symbols. So you can have a symbol that means either a full word or it means a phonetic part of a word, right? And there will be an extra symbol that dictates what it means. It also, hieroglyphs actually is about the number of symbols within the writing system. Alphabets are writing systems that are like between, I think, 20 and 30 symbols. And that writing system, the symbol within that writing system dictates a phonetic. Runes are a writing system that is like, I think, under 20 or maybe it's under 18 characters within that writing system. And so there are different writing systems that have different terminology because of the way those writing systems work. But a lot of times when we're thinking within Western thought or Western academia, what we talk about is only the alphabet, is only writing based on our thought process of the alphabet, a phonetic writing, or a writing based on just a few different symbols instead of having the broader base of symbols, right? And so um, when we're talking about writing and we're talking like history versus prehistory, it's very important to understand that history is written word. Yet written word actually goes back a little bit further than we think it does. And in some places, written word doesn't start until much later. And because of that, history actually adjusts its timeline depending on where you're at, right? So history within the Western Hemisphere doesn't technically start until 1492 when we see the Europeans invade the Western Hemisphere and bring their style of writing. And this is why it's called history at this point, because it's the written story through European style writing. That doesn't mean that there's not 50,000 years prior to that that people were here in the Western Hemisphere. What it means is that um, European academics in their, joy of their own self aggregation and how great that they are, really have a hard time seeing anything that doesn't follow suit with their very narrow viewpoint, right? So prehistory is really anything that predates uh, the written word as a telling of the stories, right? And yes, pictographs are in fact a form of writing. Yet when we're talking history versus prehistory, um, I believe pictographics to be a form of writing, and I would believe hieroglyphics are writing, which is, I mean, technically very true, right? Yet, I also know that when you're talking within academic circles, they believe that the form of writing that counts for history versus prehistory is only cuneiform. Everything prior to cuneiform is prehistory, everything after cuneiform is history. This follows the same thought process when Europeans reach the Western Hemisphere, right? So, I personally believe that oral tradition, and it's not even a belief. I personally, everything that I have read and everything that I know and everything that I have learned over the course of my time learning shows that oral tradition actually has a tendency to be more correct than written history. So, oral tradition and oral tradition cultures and cultures that use oral tradition actually increases memory. And oral tradition isn't a game of telephone. People like to think it's a game of telephone, but oral tradition, if I were to teach you history within an oral tradition, I might give you three lines. This is something specifically with the Celts that were done. You do it in a three-line stanza, you do it in a meter that is memorable, a rhythm that is memorable. So I might give you three lines on Homo erectus, and then I'm going to have you repeat those three lines back to me. And when you can get those three lines back to me word for word, then we move on to the next three lines. So it's not that I'm repeating it to somebody who's repeating it to you, to repeat it to you, to repeat it to you like a game of telephone. It's actually something where I tell you something and you repeat it back to me until you absolutely know it for fact. So oral traditions and oral stories, oral knowledge, oral history, for lack of a better terminology, actually is to everything that I have seen, it tends to be more correct than written history, right? It tends to not be somebody writing down what they heard from somebody else that is going to benefit whatever king they're writing for, right? So, prehistory again is anything that really predates our form of our understanding of when written word starts. And again, that depends really on whether or not you buy totally into uh, Western thought process academics, or whether or not you have a little bit of a broader mind. Absolutely. Absolutely. The same scientific community that is for members only, not outside that community. Absolutely. It's a very narrow-minded community, right? It's a very problematic space, right? Many of us these days are entering into that space to kind of disrupt it, to kind of make it change up, to kind of make it something different, right? So, absolutely. Let's talk about who's behind me since we've got some comments going in the chat here. So, the Gravachians are between 40 and 30,000 years ago in Western Eurasia. And the Gravachians are the descendants of the Aluatians, who are the first people to come in. They are genetically the same, it's just an advancement in culture. And this picture is a Gravatian. So, these are the first groups of people who are moving into Europe. Um, we're looking at the people who are the foundation genetics of everybody who is there today, right? So when so race has been debunked, just so you're aware, race has been debunked. The theory of race has been debunked. Racism still unfortunately exists, and culture and ethnicity absolutely exists, but race has been debunked. So your black, white kind of stuff. That's not real. That's just not how it really works, right? So when you're looking at the first movements of Europeans into Western Eurasia, this is what we're looking at. We should start that though with our understanding of the start of Homo sapien. Our understanding of the start of Homo sapien currently is that recently we came across this understanding that, well, for a long time we thought that everybody speciates out of isolation. If somebody is isolated from the rest of their group, they adapt to the area that they're in. And because they're isolated from the rest of their group and there's no cross genetics, that adaptation ends up speciating them from a different group, right? So, our oldest current find of Homo sapien is in Morocco in North Africa. There are, that one is 300,000 years old. And there are roughly 3 or 4 finds between that and 200,000 years old in different areas of Africa. Founder population, yeah. And it can be, there's a few different terms. We have founder, bottleneck, there's a couple of different things within it. We realized last year that instead of speciating through isolation, which is what we thought was pretty much the main method of speciation, that what has been thought of as a theoretical method of speciation is really how we speciated. Not only us, but the species before us that we speciate from convergence. Now, speciation through convergence is when you have multiple groups of different species who have a recent common ancestor and they're intermixing, right? They're often living together in the same space and they're interbreeding. And those interbreeding is what creates Homo sapiens. So, what we're understanding now is that the start of Homo sapiens starts from a convergence of several different species that are either direct descendants of Homo erectus or are subspecies of Homo erectus. So we're seeing Homo erectus, Homo heidelbergensis, Homo ergaster, Homo antecessor, and these groups are all living together in bands. Tribe means a community based on genetic lineage. Their citizenship is based on their genetic lineage. A band means a community based on need, right? Just everybody needing to have community. So it has no genetic citizenship base, right? Like you don't have to be genetically related to become a citizen in a band. So when we are looking at these early bands of humans, what we're seeing is that there are many different humans in this band. Homo means human, right? So that's the Latin word for human. So there are many groups of human within these bands. And these many groups of humans within these bands converge to start making the first Homo sapiens. Our current understanding is that at least 3 different groups of humans are intermixing in their own bands in different parts of Africa. And that intermixing in their own bands in different part of Africa creates a few Homo sapien here and a few Homo sapien here and a few Homo sapien here. So when we see that these 3 or 4 different groups within Africa that are different bands, different communities that are band-based, so ergaster and heidelbergensis and antecessor and erectus up here, and ergaster and heidelbergensis and antecessor and erectus down here, right? These different groups, as they're converging, you might get 2 or 3 different Homo sapiens here, and 2 or 3 different Homo sapiens here, and 2 or 3 different Homo sapiens here. It's not to roughly 135 to 125,000 years ago that a convergence happens of all of these different groups of Homo sapiens, children who are half one species and half another and look like us, right? And so these children of half one species and half another who look like us start actually meeting other people who look like them. And they're like, wow, you look like me. So maybe we should hang out. And we start to see a convergence of Homo sapien as a singular species. We see that convergence of Homo sapien as a singular species roughly ends between 25 and 125 to 135,000 years ago. We do see, though, that the start of the species, the very first Homo sapien that we know of currently, is from Morocco in North Africa. And then there are a couple of other Homo sapiens that we have in finds within the next 100,000 years in different parts of Africa. At about 150,000 years ago, we start moving into the Levant area. Now, the Levant area at this time, because of the last glacial maximum, is still a part of Africa. So it is really just another area within Africa. We have actually found many things that we think to be the missing link. We've talked about some of them in here. Graciopithecus freibergi is one of the missing links. So they do exist. So when we're seeing the movement into the Levant area at a roughly 150,000 years ago, we're seeing that this movement into the Levant is kind of as we're finishing our convergence into a singular species as Homo sapien. And it is at a time when we meet the Neanderthals. Now, there is evidence that there is meeting of the Neanderthals by early Homo sapiens prior to this because Neanderthals don't have a Y DNA. The Y DNA that we see in Neanderthal is either Denisovan Y DNA or Neanderthal or sapien Y DNA. So we live roughly 100,000 years in a couple of different caves side by side. They're like a 5-minute walk from each other in a space in the Levant with Neanderthals. And during this time, the Neanderthals have come down from Eurasia because Eurasia is under ice at this time because of the last glacial maximums. And we're moving up because the temperatures are changing, and this is a good space for us to be in. Yes, Noah, absolutely. Um, so, how do we debunk race theory? So, race theory is created in the 1850s by my field. The idea that we have races starts before then, but they're based on the biblical thought process that we're looking at the children of Ham and they're marked by God, and that different skin tones are kind of a mark of God. In the 1850s, when evolution starts to become understood and the biblical thought process starts to fall to the side, and we start to see a scientific thought process enter it. Um, we have a group of scientists who kind of need to double down on the atrocities that they have been committing. So they create the theory of race and they create the theory of eugenics. And within the theory of race, what the theory of race states is that your phenotype dictates your genotype. So your phenotype or what you look like dictates your intelligence level, dictates how you feel pain or whether you feel pain, dictates whether or not you're a hard worker, dictates whether or not you're good at sports, dictates all of these different internal things that have nothing to do with the external look, right? And so this is very much old white European men doubling down on the atrocities that they've been committing. They're trying to justify what they have been doing. And so they start this theory of race. Um, they're using tools that are more artistic in representation for the most part than they are scientific. And they're using a lot of pseudoscience. We see things like using measurements of the skull, which is absolute pseudoscience. And when we see this moving along, we see that we get to the point where we have the science to do things like DNA. And when they start working with DNA, they do what's called the Whole Genome Project. The Whole Genome Project, done by anthropologists, so we are talking the same field that creates the theory of race, right? Is absolutely where the theory of race comes from. I'm an archaeologist and an anthropologist. I would know that my field creates this theory. So when we see that the theory of race is starting to be adjusted or starting to be looked at by neuroscience and starting to be investigated by DNA, we see that within the DNA of humanity, we see that race doesn't actually exist. We see that within a primary population, there's more genetic difference than there are between primary populations. So a singular primary population, you and your next door neighbor have lived in the same space for 100 generations. You're going to be more genetically different than you're going to be from somebody in an entirely different primary population across the globe. This is because as humans, we have like 25,000 genomes. And it's also because you don't want him to breed. You don't want to have too many of the same genome, the same genes hitting up against each other because this causes mutation, right? And so to prevent interbreeding, to prevent a mutation of our genomes, to make sure that our children are healthy, you're seeing that there are different genomes within primary populations, different genetics within primary populations, and they're more vastly different than they are between primary populations. And so this is where the Whole Genome Project actually debunks the theory of race about 10 years ago, right? So the theory of race in itself has been debunked by the field that created the theory of race, right? So we also know today that things like more Black people are prone to heart problems has more to do with redlining than it has to do with actual genetics, right? So if we toss a whole bunch of people into an area and we give them all the same food, if they're having responses to the same food, it has nothing to do with their skin color. It has everything to do with the food that we're giving them, right? Any theory out there was invented by a scientist. Fact. Theories come from scientists. That's what a theory is. It's scientific. So scientists did invent the theory of race, and scientists debunked the theory of race. Absolutely. So that's how we've debunked the theory of race, Noah. Um, when we're looking at us moving out of Africa, let's go ahead and step back into that. What we're looking at is that at 150,000 years ago, Homo sapiens starts moving into the Levant area. And when Homo sapien is living in the Levant area and they're intermixing with Neanderthal, they get a lot of um, advancement in their thought process. They get a lot of advancement in their tool usage. They they get a lot of advancement in the way that they're doing things, right? We see that Neanderthals are the first, besides Naledi at 300,000 years ago, to bury their dead. We also see that Neanderthals do cave art before us. We see that Neanderthals are cooking better food, creating ovens before us. We see that Neanderthals are extremely advanced. Newest studies actually show that Neanderthals are just as intelligent as we are. So we see that as Homo sapien is coming into contact with Neanderthal, Homo sapien is learning many of these different things. They're learning new tool usages and new tool assemblages. They're learning new ways to create clothing. They're learning new ways to cook. And there's a lot of intermixing and a lot of intermingling. We have no evidence that there is violence between Homo sapiens and Neanderthal. We have no evidence that there is violence in Homo sapiens prior to 10,000 years ago, right? So prior to this, there's not a whole lot of thought process that there is any violence. All these meetings that we're running into are very if I see if I live in a band and I've only got like 10 people in my band and a band needs roughly 30 people to actually make sure that a child comes from neonate to adult, then I need more people. So I see you and I'm like, I don't care who the fuck you are as long as you're going to help me. Do you know how to hunt? Can you skin really good? Let's go hunting together, right? So we're seeing that as we're meeting different peoples, we're actually intermingling with them. We're actually intermixing. This is why pretty much everybody on the planet has Neanderthal DNA. And as we're moving out, this all really happens. Every time we run into a new group of human, we end up having sex with new groups of human. We are very notorious for you look different and I want to have sex with you because you look different. That's just how we are. So as we're moving out of the Levant area, after spending roughly 100,000 years in the Levant area with Neanderthals, we're taking these new tools that we have learned from Neanderthal with us. Neanderthal at this point, and at the point that we start meeting Neanderthal really is roughly like 10,000 as a species. They have gone through two near extinction events. And in these near extinction events, the amount of who they are as a species has very severely narrowed, and their genetics have very severely narrowed. And so by the time we really come in contact with Neanderthal as we're leaving this space in Africa, we're meeting a species that is marrying their cousins and their aunts because they don't have a broad enough species base. So seeing us gives them new genetics and like, hey, baby, come on over, right? Because everybody knows, even that far back, people can see that interbreeding is or inbreeding, not interbreeding, but inbreeding is absolutely very harmful for our species and for other species, right? And so we're seeing that Neanderthal is welcoming us in, teaching us new things, becoming a part of who we are, and we're becoming a part of who Neanderthal is. So as we're moving into Western Eurasia, and our current knowledge is that that movement into Sleepy is one of my mods universe. If you want to attack Sleepy, you can move on. So as we're moving into this space, our new evidence shows that we're kind of moving out roughly 54,000 years ago into Eurasia. Now, it should be understood that we're never still as a species. We're constantly moving as a species, constantly intermixing, constantly moving about different places, right? And as we are looking at this movement through, as we are looking at this movement out, we are looking at moving into an area that at this point of time, Neanderthal has been in for 600,000 years, and they have a lot of knowledge as what is going on in this area. And so we're moving in many cases, with Neanderthals or children of Neanderthals that we've had, right? Neanderthals don't leave as a species until 40,000 years ago. So for roughly 10,000 years, we're living side by side with Neanderthals in Eurasia. Um, the first group of sapien going into Eurasia, we call the Aleutians. And they are, again, starting there around 54,000 years ago. And that time period as being called by us evaluations ends at like 40,000 years ago. So roughly about the time frame that Neanderthal is gone. When we see this movement into this area, we see that they're taking a lot of traditions that they've already gotten from Neanderthal and a lot of traditions that they're already carrying through Eurasia with them. You go to school to become an archaeologist. And you got to take anthropology courses because anthropology is the major field and archaeology is a subfield in anthropology. So as they're moving through and they're moving through with the Neanderthals and they're carrying these traditions, they're carrying things like burial of the dead, they're carrying things like cave art, they're carrying things like tailored clothing, fire usage, different tool assemblages that are more advanced, right? So 10,000 years ago is the start of the rise of violence. We don't see violence prior to that. So I'm not looking at it through glittery eyes. I'm looking at the reality. You're looking at it through pessimistic eyes, thinking that your current reality has always existed. And the idea that your current reality has always existed is extremely egocentric and extremely false because your current reality has not always existed. And as somebody who grew up backwoods and off grid and literally learned how to sew and cook over an open fire and embroider and work hides and track and hunt before I went to school, before I went to an American based school, I have to tell you that that life, that way of life is much healthier and much happier than the way of life you're living now. And that the safety within that way of life is much higher than the safety that you experience today. So you're looking at it through the pessimistic eyes of somebody who can only see society as they see society currently. I'm looking at the reality. And you can take that anywhere you want to. We are all animals. Most animals are healthier and happier than we are today. Look outside. Look into the forest. Most animals are safer than we are today. Most animals live better lives than we do today because most animals don't have a government that controls them. And most animals aren't taught to hate each other. Most animals aren't taught to other and hate each other so that a government can maintain control over them. That's just it. And those are the literal facts of it. Yeah, animals don't self-destruct the way we do. And we only self-destruct because we're living in a society that teaches us to self-destruct because narcissistic god kings like to hoard shit. Animals don't fight for survival. They don't. You think that they do because somebody gave you the propaganda that they do, but they don't. The beaver is snug in his den. He doesn't fight anybody for that den. He's happy and he's content. A person that has lived in a cave for 300 generations is safer than you will ever be living in the house that you bought last year, or even the house your mother bought, because the government can take it from you tomorrow. Right? So, when we are looking at this movement in, right, natural selection has actually been disproven. Nice try, but natural selection has actually been proven false. Again, that goes along with the whole idea of eugenics and race. This is built on racism. This is built on the thought process of trying to justify atrocity, really, right? So natural selection really isn't it, right? So when we're seeing this movement within and this carrying of traditions, the carrying of traditions that no, that's not evolution. Obviously, you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm going to ask you to actually, I'm just not going to address anymore. You don't know what you're talking about. If you would like to stay and actually listen and actually get some education, you're more than welcome to. Otherwise, have at whatever. So this movement, carrying these traditions, the traditions that we're carrying in have a lot to do with who we are at this time, right? What we value at this time. We've proven that I took a class on math. Does that make me a mathematician? I mean, honestly, I can barely tell you 2 plus 2 equals 4, but I took a math class, so, I'm an expert now. Um, so this movement through is really encompassing many different thought processes. The latest studies that we have show that there's no real thought process of gender roles prior to a few hundred years ago, right? That, well, I guess prior to the ancient Greeks would be our first processes of gender roles. And they're only within the ancient Grecian society. And then they kind of move along where societies adapt the ancient Grecian thought process. But gender roles aren't around prior to that. Biologically, we have three sexes, not two. Another thing that many people do not understand. We know now that hunter gatherers, women are hunting just as much as men are hunting. It's not a gender bias, right? And so as we're moving through in our early stages into Eurasia, we need to understand that we're not moving into Eurasia as a species like we think of ourselves today. There's no evidence of violence. There's no evidence of a thought process that we must hoard. There's no evidence of a thought process that men are better than women or that there are gender roles within this thought process. All of these things are made up by you. And they're made up, not made up by you specifically, but made up by society today. And all of these ideas come from this indoctrination that most of us have received. Now, as we're moving through and taking these different things with us across these different spaces, we see plenty of evidence of this. We see that our earliest tattooing is 35,000 years ago. We see that there are actually stone tattoo tools or single point tattoo tools in a cave in France that have both blood, human blood on them, and ink, like pigment. So our oldest tools, our oldest evidence of tattooing is 35,000 years ago. And we see that this is something that we're kind of carrying with us into this space, that we're kind of taking with us into these different spaces. We see that tailored clothing is another thing that we're taking within these spaces. Not tailored like you go down to the tailor and you get your suit tailored, but tailor as in clothing that actually fits your body instead of having a whole lot of different openings, like you're just not getting a lot of air on the skin, right? So clothing that actually is fitting to the body and fitted to the body. And we're also taking with us different, not just stone tools. We like to think that people are only using stone tools, and it's because things like basketry, things like wood tools dissolve a lot faster, they degrade a lot faster, right? And because of the degradation, we're not finding many of them. Recently, we found a lot more. You might have seen the huge article that came across recently, the 500,000-year-old wooden structure within Africa made by Homo heidelbergensis, right? And so we do know that we're building wooden structures prior to Homo sapien actually being here, right? So we're carrying this information with us. We're taking this information with us into Western Eurasia as we're moving into Western Eurasia. So 40,000 years ago, the start of the Gravatian culture starts. At this point, we see that Neanderthal has pretty much died out. We don't really see a whole lot of evidence of Neanderthal after this. And we see that we have become pretty much the only human that we know of, especially in Western Eurasia. There are still some other humans across the planet that, like we know now that Denisovan dies off in its final. The last Denisovan that we have is like 13,000 years ago. We know now that there might possibly be Homo florensis still on the island of Flores in Indonesia. There's been sightings of them within the last 50 years. So in other parts of the world, there might possibly be other humans. Yet in Western Eurasia, we are the only ones there. I might have. Unfortunately, English is a bastardized language made up of 10, 12 different languages, and nobody in the United States pronounces or spells any of it correctly. And I never do. So as we're moving through, and we have become the only species that is left within this space, right? We are developing this culture even further. So our ideas of self versus you, like I am me and you are you, this starts with Neanderthal. The idea of identity starts with the Neanderthal, and then it kind of crosses over into Homo sapien, and then it really gets carried down. But anything that has to do with bodily decoration, like the hair covering that this man is wearing, or the necklace that this man is wearing, or the different ways that he might, like maybe different colored furs on his body, right? Or tattooing, or facial painting, or body painting. All of these different things have to do with identity, id, the conscious self. I am self and you are self, right? I am me and you are you. That consciousness of self, this is how we identify ourselves to others. These are our identity markers to others. I might be the people of the hair shell people, and you over there might be the neck shell people, right? Like I identify me and you identify you. as we're carrying these thought processes of identity through Western Eurasia, we start to see this thought process of identity really come into artistic style. We see a lot of cave art that really starts coming into being that shows identity within it, shows, hunting, shows different scenes of life within it. And we also start to see things like our statues of our Venuses, the Venus of Willendorf, which is a Gravachian Venus, the Venus of Brassamphi, which is another Gravachian Venus. We also see our first anamorphic, which is something, a statue or an artwork or a piece of something that is both human and animal. When we start to see like the 40,000-year-old carving of a lion-headed man who has actually evidence of tattooing on his body, right? And that's 40,000 years old. So when we start to look at this movement forward, we're taking with us this sense of identity. And we're taking with us this sense of identity in the way that we decorate ourselves, in the way that we hold ourselves, in the way that we interact with others, and in the things that the culture that we're imbuing, right? It is thought that the headgear that we see within the Gravachians, that we see on the Brassamphi Venus, and we see on the Willendorf Venus, which is this headdress here, actually has something to do with midwifery instead of actually being like it's a denotion of occupation instead of just being a standard headdress or a goddess headdress, right? And it is thought that maybe the goddesses, as we think of them as goddesses, might actually be things for fertility or to denote, hey, this person is, we got to go find the midwife or things like that, or the person that is carrying this is a midwife, right? So these are some newer thoughts that we're coming across and some newer interpretations of the thought process, right? And so when we're looking at skin color, which tends to be so important to everybody, it needs to be understood that because we speciate as a species in Africa, we speciate with dark skin, which is only a higher concentration of melanin. Everybody has melanin within their skin. Those who are darker have a higher concentration of melanin. And it has to do with protection from the sun, right? It has to do protection of UV. Actually, so the idea that we all start in Africa is not a lie. That's never been debunked. The idea that we left Africa 150,000 years ago and Europeans advanced further than anybody else is what has been debunked because it was racist and it was wrong. Okay. Yet the idea that we all start in Africa is absolutely factual. As Homo sapiens, we all start within Africa. Okay. The idea that Homo sapien leaves Africa 150,000 years ago, and now everybody outside of Africa at 150,000 years ago advances further than anybody inside of Africa did. That racist ideology, that has been debunked. But the fact that we all start in Africa has never been debunked, right? We didn't advance faster. Your idea of advancement is pretty false. So starting in Africa, we know that Homo sapien, like Homo erectus before us, starts darker, starts with dark eyes, and starts with tightly coiled hair. The reason for the tightly coiled hair is that it creates a shade over the head and a lattice work that air can move through, which cools the brain so that the brain doesn't overheat. And so, as a species, this is how we start. And as we're moving outside of Africa, as we're moving into other regions, we lose these things over time as our bodies adapt. Now, the advantage is dark skin. The advantage everywhere is dark skin. We can get vitamin D from plants and animals. Like vitamin D comes from many different spaces. So the advantage really everywhere is dark skin. The real advantage, though, is our ability to adapt by the region along the equator in which we live. And that adaptation of our phenotype does not change what the genotype is within. So a really good example of this is cheddar man. Cheddar man is 10,000 years ago in Britain. Cheddar man was found in Cheddar in Britain, and cheddar man is dark skin, and the alleles for his skin are shown to be, the verbiage is sub-Saharan black for the alleles of his skin, and his eyes are blue. Okay. Now, Cheddar Man's direct descendant, like 300 generation direct great grandson, lives a mile from where Cheddar Man lives. Now, over 300 generations, Cheddar Man's direct descendant has adapted to the area that he lives in. And so his skin is no longer dark. His skin now is light. His eyes are still blue, right? The first adaptation that we get as we move outside of Africa into Eurasia is our eyes. Our eyes are the first thing that start to adapt because light eyes are for low light environments. Light eyes see better in low light because they allow more light in. And by allowing more light in, they allow more sight within a low light environment. So light eyes are the first thing that we adapt as we're moving into Western Eurasia and moving into Eurasia, because by adopting light eyes, we're able to see predators better. We're able to see what's going on better. We're able to see things around us better. So we adapt light eyes much, God, at least 10,000 years before we adapt light skin. We don't actually start getting light skin as you know, somewhere near half the population has light skin until about 5,000 years ago. And we actually, at 1,000 years ago in Scandinavia, see that roughly 10% of the population is still very dark of skin. Egil Skallagrimsson is described as being very dark of skin. And so there are many people who are Viking who are actually dark of skin and are Norwegian born or Scandinavian born, right? So when we're looking at this movement through, the first adaptation that we get is the lighter eyes. Now, adaptations to a space take 100 generations. For humans, that's 2,500 years. We have a generational space of 25 years currently. This is probably less prior. So, roughly maybe 2,000 years, 40,000 years ago. And as we're adapting within space, it's also important to understand that adaptation doesn't actually go from, no, that's not true. The highest percentage of Neanderthal DNA in modern humans is actually in Asia. So, as this adaptation goes, we must understand that I don't go from extremely dark to extremely light in 100 generations. I go from extremely dark to brown in 100 generations, and then from brown to less brown in another 100 generations, and then from less brown to maybe white in 100 generations, right? It is not something that it's not like you're going from one extreme to the other extreme in 100 generations. That's not how adaptation works. Adaptation is a slow thing. It works as the world works, right? We also know now that the alleles for light skin and the alleles for dark skin, the alleles that we have for our skin are not just dependent on genetics. They're actually dependent on genetics and dependent on environment, much more dependent on environment. So we know now that if you say somebody who is lighter of skin were to go to South Africa and not live inside their entire pregnancy, their child might be born a few shades darker than they are because their child has been adapted well in utero as they go forward. I don't usually recommend a lot of books on the subject. The reason that I don't really recommend a lot of books on the subject is because the field is changing so fast currently. I have a lot of articles on the website that I have under my bibliographies that you can go and find and then do further research based on those articles. And you're more likely to get current information than you would through most books, right? Because most books, currently, by the time they're printed, something else has come along and it's no longer exactly the facts anymore, right? So I don't usually recommend a lot of books. I do have a couple of books I think that I put on my website, but not a whole lot. As we are moving into these regions, and we're Michael, if you Mission Man, whatever, if you have an article that shows that, you're welcome to share the article that shows that. The scientific journals that I read tell me that the highest presence of Neanderthal DNA is between 4 and 5% Neanderthal DNA, and it's all in Western Asia or Eastern Asia. So it's not in Tuscany, right? Um, and you're right. I maintain that we are all just shades of brown. None of us are white unless we have albinoism, and that is correct. We are all shades of brown. And really, it is just the concentration of melanin. Some people have a more, it's not diverse, dispersed, more dispersed concentration of melanin, and some people have a higher concentration of melanin. Same thing with our eyes. Our eyes are all about the melanin concentration. So when we are looking at when we're looking at these movements through and we're looking at the culture that's coming in, we are looking at a people who are dark. We're looking at a people who have dark eyes, and we are looking at a people who have tightly coiled hair. We do not see the changes towards that lighter need or the lighter eyes really coming for at least 20,000 years. Our first evidence of having the lighter eyes is 10,000 years ago, and that in Homo sapiens, and that is Cheddarman. So Gravachians are, from 40,000 years ago to 30,000 years ago. So they're gone as a culture, though not as genetic people, for 20,000 years before we start to see light eyes really becoming a thing within the populations of Eurasia. And again, we don't see lighter skin come until after we see the lighter eyes coming. We're also looking at a culture that is carrying through concepts of thought as well. So when we're looking at things that seem to be pretty global in concept, like a tree of life is something that is pretty global in concept. Many different cultures around the globe have a thought process of the tree of life. We're looking at things that are probably rooted in our ancient past. They're probably things that are, really origin to us. Like they're things that we thought before we start moving out. We think as we're our start of a species, right? And so we're carrying many of these traditions with us as we're moving through too. And these traditions we see in things like the artwork, these thought processes, these faiths, are things that we see in the artwork. They're things that we see in the anamorphic statues. They're things that we see in, the tattooing and things like that, that we know is happening. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence of what those tattoo styles are looking like at 40,000 years ago. Our first evidence really of any tattooing is on physical, would be like the visual of tattooing would be that anamorphic lion-headed statue where he has like 4 or 5 marks along his arm that look to be tattoo marks, right? So as we're settling into Europe, we spend 40,000 years in Europe as dark-skinned, dark-eyed, tightly coiled hair people before we start to adapt in that region and actually get lighter eyes and lighter skin. So this is what your ancestors look like if you come from Eurasia. This is what the ancestors of everybody across this planet look like as they're coming from Eurasia, right? And this is important on so many levels because so many of us, like the person in the chat going, nah, get so twisted up in our panties over the idea that we started dark, right? They like to think that they're the superior. That's that white supremacist thought process, right? And in their need to think that they're superior, they get their panties twisted in a bunch over the idea that we all start dark, right? That's their racism showing, and it's okay because it just shows us who they are up front. The Sami are usually light of skin and dark of eye. So two different groups move into Scandinavia at 7,000 years ago. And those two different groups that move into Scandinavia at 7,000 years ago, one is from Southern Eurasia, the descendants of the Gravachians actually, and they're dark of skin and light of eye. And the other is from the steppes. And this is the Finno-Uraic peoples coming over from the steppes, and they are light of skin and dark of eye. This has been proven through archaeological studies. And the Sami are the descendant of the light of skin and dark of eye people who are coming over from the steppes. They speak Finno-Uraic languages. And the descendants of the dark-skinned, light-eyed people are who we consider to be the majority of the Scandinavians today, right? So when we're looking at this, what we're looking at is a lack of concept of othering, right? There's this lack of concept of othering. The concept of othering doesn't come until much later. The concept that, you're different and so there's something wrong with you. It's much later. Up until 10,000 years ago, when something is different, we actually have sex with it more likely than not, right? That's how everybody gets so many different species within them, right? So when the Gravachians are moving through, the things that we know within the Gravachians really have a lot to do with their artwork and really have a lot to do with the way that they're decorating self. So what we know with the Gravachians, again, is that they are wearing tailored clothing that is made of fur. This clothing is often painted or dyed with ochre or soot Or sometimes there's a white matter, and I can't remember what the white matter is, but the white matter actually interacts as well, right? I don't deal with anti-Semitism. It is, like I didn't really say this at the start of this because of the fact that we really only had like 10 people in here and most of them were people I know. So let me go ahead and say this now. This is my space. TikTok gives anybody who reaches 1,000 followers their own space and they get to control their own space. This is my space. It's my house. You're coming into my house and I get to control the space. I'm an archaeologist, an anthropologist, a historian, and a healer. I've been studying this stuff for 40 something odd years. I have degrees. This is one of the 2 degrees that I have. And I come into TikTok to teach. I come into TikTok to give a very basic information of what is going on because so many people don't get that very basic education. It is kept behind $40,000 a year paywalls, and it is gate kept with language that is hard for people, even with several degrees and extensive knowledge, to understand sometimes. And because of those factors, it's not information that a lot of people have access to. And I want to make sure that everybody has access to as much information as possible because our indoctrinated society is the problem. So I come in to teach, and this is my space. And while you're in my house, I've already taught you how race theory has been debunked. I don't do racism in here. If you want to be a racist asshat, you can scroll your little shit on, or I'm going to report you, or I'm going to tell you what I think of what a POS you are for being a racist asshat. And the other thing that I don't deal with really well in here is phobias based on gender and desire. As I stated, we have 3 biological sexes, right? I myself am 2 spirit. I embody 2 different biological, well, 2 different genders, not biological sexes, 2 different genders. And I don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire. So if you want to bring your racism into my thought process or your phobias into my thought process, you can scroll your morally inept ass somewhere else because we don't deal with it in here. And that includes anti Semitism. Free Palestine every fucking day of the week because Palestinians are indigenous and Israel is the colonizer. But do not bring your anti Semitism into my space. Take it out along with your racism. You're going to get reported, you're going to get blocked, and you will not like my response. Okay? So, that said, let's go ahead and continue our discussion on who we are as a people as we're moving into Europe. Okay? Actually, we do have intersex skeletons. If you don't know a subject and somebody who knows a subject tells you something on that subject, maybe your best bet is to and listen until you know something on the subject before you start running your mouth on the subject. Just saying. Um, when we are looking at the, yeah, you need to just, thank you. Yo, Daddy, well, I don't deal with anti Semitism. I really don't want that flag being flown all over the place in my chat either, because there's a lot of problem behind it right now. Okay. So I'm just going to ask you once to kind of stop with the flag. If not, yep, we'll deal with that. So when we're moving into these different spaces, as we're moving into these different spaces, again, we are actually absolutely moving into these different spaces as brown people. We are dark of skin, we are dark of eye, and we have tightly coiled hair. And as we are, I really, like I said, I'm not going to deal with your anti Semitism, but I'm also not going to deal with the fact that you're flying flags like that because of the fact that we are dealing with a group that is colonizing, right? We are dealing with colonizers, and I don't deal with colonizers any more than I deal with hate, right? Hate is colonization, and colonization is hate. So when we are looking at this movement within and these carrying of traditions within, we are looking at this carrying of tradition that includes bodily decoration, that includes understanding of thought process, that includes tailored clothing, that includes extensive cooking. We recently found flatbread in Neanderthal camps, right? I'm indigenous, Vincent. and you're flying a colonizer's flag and you want to tell an indigenous person to leave their land while flying a colonizer's flag. So, the different things that we're seeing, one of them is a hairdress. And we have a couple of different ideas of what this hairdress means. Um, Whether or not we're looking at different braids that have shell beads within them, or whether or not we're looking at a cap of shell beads, we're not exactly sure. We have a couple of different thought processes on what it could mean. We see a lot of this cowrie shell work, though. We see a lot of different cowrie shells that, don't call me baby boo, just saying. Um, we see a lot of different shell work along a lot of different. So we're going to turn it off for just a little bit because it just becomes too much for my thought process. We will turn it back on so that questions can be answered. And we do see that on, I do also have, as you can see, the YouTube over here. So you can go over to YouTube and comment if you need to ask questions before I turn the questions back on. But I am going to turn it off. It is becoming a lot for me, and I know it is becoming a lot for the people in the chat. Not only is it distracting for me because I have to say, like, it's very much, I was going to leave it on subscribers only, honey pie. It becomes distracting for me because of my ADD, right? And because I, always answer. But it also becomes distracting for other people, especially when it's very filled with hate. Nobody really wants to watch your hate. Nobody really wants to deal with the hate that you envision, and nobody really wants your shit, right? So you can take it elsewhere. So we'll go ahead and turn them off for a while. Like I said, if you really need to comment, the YouTube channel is there and it is going right now. So you can go over there and ask questions on there. It just provides an extra step. I will turn them back on within here so that I can answer questions within here in case you have questions. And so everybody has the opportunity to ask questions. I really don't like to kind of block people from asking questions, but I also really don't like to deal with the shit sometimes. And it's late at night, so my tolerance has gone down. And we're seeing that a lot of the clothing is decorated with shells. We're also seeing that there's a lot of like ochre use, charcoal use. I think the white is almost like a chalk, but I can't remember exactly what it is. And we see that this is stuff that can be like ground into the leather, or it can be moistened and then ground into the leather. So it's kind of a paint or a dye. It's the same stuff that we're seeing used within cave art. And it is the same stuff that we're seeing used within painting a body, and evidence of it is being used within tattooing. Again, our earliest evidence of tattooing would either be the 40,000-year-old anamorphic statue of the lion head that is a Gervasian statue, or it would be the 35,000-year-old tattooing tools that we see in a cave in France. So these different things that we decorate our body with are about our sense of identity. They're about saying, I am me and you are you. And they're about identifying with the world around us as well. So as a species, like every other species, we are adapted by the environment, by the biome, to fill a niche in the biome. Every species on this planet is here to fill a niche in the biome. And the niche in the biome that we are here to fill is the tending niche. It is our job as a species to tend the biome, to create a better and safer space for animals, to create a better other animals, because we are animals, to create a better and safer space in the biome. This is done in a lot of times through honorable harvest. Honorable harvest is a phrase used within many Turtle Island indigenous nations, Turtle Island being North America. Yet it is something that we see in animistic cultures everywhere. And what it is the knowledge that when I'm out collecting, I collect what I need. I don't collect more than what I need. Whether I'm collecting berries or sweetgrass or basketry tools, right? No matter what it is I'm collecting, I only collect what I need. And I only collect in the time period that plant is entering into its dormant phase, so that I'm not actually causing harm to that plant. I'm pruning it back by collecting. Maybe I'm breaking off the branches of a willow tree. And by breaking off the branches of the willow tree so I can use those branches to create baskets, I'm actually pruning that willow tree back so that next spring, when it starts to grow, it can grow fuller. This is our purpose. This is why we are here. We weren't created by an outside creator. We were developed within the biome to fulfill a niche within the biome, just like every other animal, just like every other plant, just like every other being within the biome. We are developed to fulfill a niche. So as people are moving throughout Eurasia, they're fulfilling these niches. They are tending the land. And this tending of the land really morphs into who they are, is really a part of who they are. This is animistic thought process. And it is really who we all are prior to 10,000 years ago, prior to the rise of the narcissistic god kings, prior to the thought process that this world is a gift that you can possess. And so as this settling within this space happens. This settling within this space creates this indigeneity within this space. Why? Because as we're settling into a space, many of us many of the, again, we're looking at the Gravatians specifically here, who are the descendants of the Aleutians, who are the first that are moving in. They're intermixing with the Neanderthals, and the Neanderthals are the original inhabitants of this space. Immigration, migration, and colonization are three different words with three very different meanings. If someone is migrating, they're moving into a space that either they've occupied before and it's part of their migratory pattern, right? Or a space that is completely new and completely unoccupied. When somebody is immigrating, they're moving into a space that is already occupying and they're becoming a part of the occupier's culture. So if I am moving into a space that is already occupying and I'm sinking into the society and the culture that is already there, this is immigration. Colonization is my moving into a space that is already occupied and replacing their government, replacing their culture, replacing their thought processes with my own, very often through violence, very often through what we call conquering. So as we are immigrating or migrating into these spaces of Eurasia. Why do I say immigrating or migrating? Some of these spaces still have Neanderthal within them, and some of these spaces do not. Again, by the time we're meeting up with Neanderthal, Neanderthal is roughly 10,000 left. They're not covering all of Western Eurasia, right? They're covering the lower part along the Mediterranean basin of Eurasia. So as we're moving up north, we're moving into space that is not occupied. As we're moving into the space that is occupied, we are moving into space that is already occupied and becoming a part of the culture there. We're not replacing it with our culture. We're not overthrowing it. We're not kicking it out. We're becoming a part of. So this is becoming indigenous to an area. So as we sink into these areas, as we become a part of these areas, as we learn the world that we're living in, this world includes the medicinal plants that we're using because medicine is as old as the Neanderthals, right? This includes the different food sources that we're finding within this area. As our languages develop, the languages that develop are languages that sink into the space, right? Those languages tell you more about the space than simple language does today, right? So the English language, being a bastardized language of 10 different languages, doesn't really describe space as easily or as fully as many indigenous languages will describe space. We've all known that the Inuit and the Inupiaq, they have like 20, 30 words for snow, right? Because snow is many different things at many different times. I come from the Pacific Northwest. In the Pacific Northwest, we actually have probably 20 different rain words for rain. Is it sleeting? Is it sheeting? Is it sprinkling? Is it drizzling? Is it pouring? Is it just a light rain? Is it misty, right? There's many different words for rain. And each of those different words for rain actually put a picture in your head if you know the language, if you know the words of what I actually mean. I can tell you that it's raining outside, but if I tell you that it's raining outside, you don't know what kind of rain it is. Yet if I tell you, oh my God, it is pouring out, you know that if you walk outside, you're going to be drenched. Yet if I tell you there's a really pretty mist outside right now, you know that you can go outside probably in your shorts and be okay, right? So as indigenous languages and develop in a space that the culture is indigenous to, that a people is adapting within, a people is developing within, the indigenous language within that space describes that space in a depth that we don't understand today. A friend of mine in this chat, we all love her, taught me about gloss, which gloss is and I might be saying it wrong, but it's Kumri, which is what we know of as Welsh. Kumri is the real word, term, and it means the color of nature. It's not like green or blue. It's many different colors, right? So this describes more broad sense of things than the trees are green, right? So as we are looking at indigenous language, what we're seeing is indigenous languages describe the things within the area in a much fuller sense. as people are becoming indigenous into an area and they're adapting within that area and they're sinking into that area and they're learning that area, excuse me, these words might describe things like um, eyebright is a word for a plant that you can use as an eye rinse that helps, right? These words might describe what this plant does. This word might describe what this animal does. These words have more of a descriptive understanding because just by the singular word alone, you're given a broad picture that we're not so much given in something like English, which is a very bastardized language. So as they're becoming indigenous to space, they're adapting into that space. Again, we talk about the fact that as we're moving out of Africa, and for 30, 40,000 years after we leave the Levant area and people are settled into, Homo sapiens are settled into Western Eurasia, they're still very dark of skin. It's not till 5,000 years ago that you start to see really any nominal presence of light skin within a population in Western Eurasia, right? And so those adaptations take time. Those adaptations take generation upon generation. We know that an adaptation takes at least 100 generations, and that doesn't mean start of adaptation to finish of adaptation. That means start of adaptation to here to get to 100 generations, right? And again, the first adaptation that we see for Homo sapiens within Western Eurasia is the light of eyes, because the lighter eye allows more light in a low light environment. So as we're sinking in and as we're becoming indigenous to space, our identity starts to matter. So we start and we are learning the medicines of the place. We're learning the earth of the place. We're learning what it means to live within that space and what is positive and negative about that space and what we need to adapt within that space, right? So the Gravatian culture is a culture that is in the middle of the process of this adjustment. They, again, the Aleutians come before the Gravatians, but they are the descendants genetically of the Aleutians, right? So we're looking at a culture that has probably been in the area for roughly 10 to 14,000 years by the time the Gravatian culture starts to rise. The Gravatian culture starts to rise, and they're moving north a little bit. And then this kind of last snap of cold comes, and so they're pushed back down along the Mediterranean basin. There's actually a replacement of genetics in one of the Gravatian groups at that time. And the Gravatian group that there's a replacement of genetics in, it's only a replacement of the Y DNA genetics. It's not a replacement of the mitochondrial DNA genetics. So it's only a replacement of the father line, right? The replacement of genetics is the Gravatian people above the Italian peninsula or within the Italian peninsula. The Gravatian people are really all along the lower part of Eurasia at this time, and they have been up into Eurasia as the Aleutians and then pushed down with that last snap of cold. So over the Italian peninsula, we see that the Y line changes out basically, and it's not at all. It's just there's this shift where the predominant Y line is not the same predominant Y line that it was before. Now, this could mean many things. It could mean that this Y line comes in from maybe Turkey, right? Or it could mean that this Y line comes in from where the Iberian Peninsula is and the Gravatians in the Iberian Peninsula. Um, I don't remember in the article where exactly they state that that Y line comes from. I do believe that it does come from the Arabian Peninsula area, though, if I like what's sticking in my head. So, and again, we're not replacing the mitochondrial line, we're replacing the Y line. We're not replacing the mother line, we're replacing the father line. All the other groups of Gravatians, though, this doesn't happen. This only happens in the Gravatians above the Italian peninsula. And again, there are roughly 3 distinct groups of Gravatians genetically all along the Mediterranean area that have gone up and now are down. At the last cold snaps end, as we're moving back up into Eurasia, we're seeing that this movement back up into Eurasia of the Gravatians, carrying this new genetics in this one group of Gravatians, is moving in and settling into space again, right? The cold has driven them down, they're going back up. And as they're settling into this space again, they're carrying the knowledge that they've had and they're sinking in. Their languages can already speak to the space because their languages I'm very burpy tonight. I apologize. Because their languages were developed within this space. Their languages speak to this space. Their languages speak to the care and the tending of this space. And they're an animistic people who are intermixed with the space. They don't set themselves above. They're another animal. We don't start believing that we're something other than an animal until extremely recently. And it really has to do with the idea that God made us, right? So as this is moving and as this is happening, the adaptations that are happening don't happen within the Gravatians. There's probably going to be some adaptation to where you might see that there is maybe lighter skin, though not light skin, right? Not even brown skin, because we know that their descendants later on are still in some areas possessing the alleles for the term is sub-Saharan black. So, and I have a hard time with the some of the terminology. So sometimes I'm going to specify this is what the term is, whether I like the term or not, right? So the term for the alleles in some are still sub-Saharan black. They're still extremely dark alleles within the skin tone, right? So we're seeing that, well, they might start adapting. They're not finished adapting, right? There's still a long way to go to get there, right? Um, we see that the food usages adapt, right? The different things that they're eating adapt with the areas that they're in. The different things that have meaning to them adapt, right? We all know things like the clan of the cave bear, right? Where cave bear becomes a center of focus for animistic thought process of worship, right? We know that there are groups today that associate themselves with different animals, right? The Sami are reindeer people, right? Uh, most people in Scandinavia consider themselves a people of the salmon, which is really cool, especially if you're also Turtle Island indigenous. And there are many people here in Turtle Island who consider themselves people of the salmon. I grew up among many, right? So there are many people even today that still relate themselves to an animal life, right? Like an animal. I use terminology like sibling, though I would need to specify that um, it's not typically like that finite for most people, right? Like it's not typically that fixed of a definition, right? But that we're all just another animal and we're all just a part of it. And we're all here within the biome, just trying to live and work within the biome, and that we all fulfill our niche within the biome. And nobody's niche within the biome is more important than anybody else's niche within the biome. Our niche of tending is not more important than the tree's niche of creating oxygen. And the trees have language. They have entire matriarchal based clans and live in forest nations, and they all communicate with each other, right? So our need to tend the environment and our niche to tend the environment does not supersede, is not greater than the tree's niche to tend the environment. The tending that the tree does is just as important as the tending that we do. And animistic thought process and animistic peoples believe this. So as we're moving through and we're moving into Eurasia, this is the thought process that we're carrying. So it's not that we're moving into this space and adapting the environment to suit us. We're moving into this space and adapting us to suit the environment. Now, for many animistic groups, even today, this is the life way, because there is an understanding that it is healthier for the environment and healthier for us to work with the environment instead of trying to control the environment, possess the environment, and destroy the environment. Our need to control, possess, and destroy the environment has led us to the sixth mass extinction, right? So there is an understanding within these peoples who are becoming indigenous within this space, who are developing languages within this space, who are developing culture, who are developing home within this space, that home within this space does not separate them, right? So we don't see the idea of possession of land until 10,000 years ago. So roughly 20,000 years after the last of the Gravatian people. Foods that we see that the Gravatians eat really have to do with where they're at and what's in the area. Like pretty much every other group on the planet, we eat what's available, right? We eat what's available to us. We know now that hunter-gatherer cultures have a tendency to do more hunting than they do gathering. The rudiment in the stomach, or the chewed up food of the herbivore that you have killed, that is in their stomach, is sustenance that we have eaten throughout our prehistory, right? Something that we can actually get all of our plant-based nutrients from is, the rudiment of the singular stomach. This is something that we see, especially a lot in the Arctic, where there's not a lot of plant life. So the plant life that you get might come from one of the herbivore species that you kill that maybe has gotten that plant life from the bottom of the sea. And so now you open up their stomach and eat the rudiment out of their stomach to get your plant life needs, right? So it will depend on which region that they're in. You might see that those who are in the regions in France are finding more lavender, right? Sage, of course, is a global thing. So you might see that sage is used by all the Gravacians across different cultures, right? Or different areas and different genetics. You might see that those who are more northern might eat more northern animals, like you might see more reindeer, right? Or seals or things like that eaten in areas that are more northern. Whereas in areas that are more southern, you might see more southern animals. Are you looking at, like a bear or deer or things like that, right? Um, we do see that there is a lot of association with sea life, right? We see a lot of shell work, a lot of shell work. And we see a lot of work with animal teeth and animal claws that is in the decorations of clothing and the decorations of hair and in the decoration of self. And we see within the cave art that there is a lot of association with different animals as important. So we'll see within the cave art a lot of the different animals that are being used, right? So you might see European bison in the cave art, right? You might see a lot, and there's usually a lot of deer, a lot of antelope, a lot of there's usually lions and different kind of predatory animals as well within the cave art. Um, I'm thinking that I went over the vast majority of decoration of self and understanding that we have of the culture and how they're moving about and how they're becoming a part of space and how they're adapting. Um, I'm not sure if I've gone over anything. I am going to go ahead and turn the comments on for a couple and see if maybe it's calmed down a bit and we can handle them on, and also open it up a bit for questions on the topic. Before I do that, I'm going to again remind everybody TikTok gives everybody with 1,000 followers a space. I use my space to educate. The reason that I use my space to educate is because I do not believe that education should be gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall. And I do not believe that it should be gate kept behind language that is hard for pretty much everybody, including people with extensive degrees of knowledge, to follow. Um, I do not deal very well with racism within my chat. We talked earlier about how the theory of race has been debunked. We can talk about that again, but the theory of race has absolutely been debunked. Race does not exist, it is a colonial construct created so that you'll hate other people instead of the government that's trying to kill you, right? And the other thing that I do not deal well within my chat is phobia based on gender and desire. Phobias based on gender and desire, along with racism, these are hate based things that are based on othering, and they're being used to kind of keep you down. And if you want to continue and participate in that, you can do it elsewhere. You can go get 1,000 followers and find your own chat and start your own chat where you can discuss just how horrific I am for not allowing your racism within my chat. So with that, I will go ahead and open it back up. And again, I ask that everybody keep it civil. This is an act of love. I come in here as an act of love, and I ask the same of you. And I ask kindness in return. Having gone over the vast majority of Gravation information that I can think of off the top of my head, it's not usually my subject. I don't usually focus on this this late in the game. Usually, I'm way earlier. I do a lot of paleoanthropology, and we talk about a lot of different species that come alongside us, and not necessarily our own species. So uh, that's pretty much the majority of my information on Gravations. I can go over some of it again if needed and necessary. We can also speak on some of the other subjects and content and thought processes that are out there, right? I'm not sure, Zumbia, referring to based on. So I have some articles on the Gravations. I have a website right here in widdaord.com, and that website compiles bibliographies so that people can go and see articles and dig deeper. They're just basic articles. Sometimes they're in journals, some are scientific journals, and sometimes they're in mainstream articles just so that you can actually access them because a lot of stuff is, paywall. Um, and it's all so that you can get a base information to do more research on your research on the information yourself. Um, Is there any evidence that the Norse people may have stayed in Turtle Island longer than the settlements in Canada would suggest? Just curious. Not that I know of, Rebecca. Most of the information that we have shows that Icelanders came over here and they would stay sometimes a winter and they would go home. Um, I think in total we're looking at like 10 years. There's not a whole lot of time spent here in Turtle Island. There is evidence that they took back either a woman with them to Iceland or the child of a woman back to Iceland, because there is mitochondrial DNA in Iceland that relates to one of the nations from the northeast coast of Turtle Island. What if life isn't real? Well, then we are in the middle of a mass. I personally believe we're in the middle of kind of like a mass matrix. I kind of think there's this matrix thought process. I believe that we're all energy, and that our consciousness creates our reality. Personally, myself, so I think that none of it could be real. Very much so. And if that is the case, then well, we've been living it this whole time. We'll be okay, right? How would I identify a legitimate scientific journal versus something with false info? A legitimate scientific journal is going to give you a list of names at the top of it, and it's going to give you a list of references and sources that names have used to actually create and compile their paper. So a mainstream journal article or a mainstream article like CNN or something like that is going to it will work for your basic, right? And you can look at that and then take that and dig deeper based on that. I'm going to move you for a second, YouTube. But a journal article in an actual journal is going to look something like this. So one second, I'm going to go ahead and flip my camera. Let me. So a journal article, this is one that is on my site about the Gravatians. It's going to look something like this. This one is on Science Direct. Honestly, I can't even do the access of the full article on Science Direct myself without purchasing it, because it has a whole lot of, it's one of those things that has a paywall. Sometimes they do only have one person, right? You will see within them, though, you're going to see, first, you're going to see an abstract. It's going to set up like a thesis. Then it's going to have an introduction, right? And then it's going to have, and it's not on here because of the fact that this is not the full article, but then it's going to have the body of the argument, and then it's going to have your conclusions. And at the bottom, it's going to have references. And those references are where you're going to go ahead and dig deeper. Like, so if I want to know more about the Gravatian culture and I'm not getting enough from this article, I might actually take this here. And I know by seeing it that it's E. Adam is the artist, the artist, right? And I might take it. This here is just now. Science.org is actually a really great journal. It's actually a really great scientific journal, and so this is another one. It's a little bit easier to get into, but I might take that article title over to here and go into. Now I'm going to use Google Scholar, just because Google Scholar can be a lot easier for most people to actually find accredited sources. When I go into Google Scholar, I might actually just paste the title of that article, right? Now I know that it was E. Adam who had that article. So I might go here and click on that, and that's going to give me that article. And in this case, and a lot of times in Google Scholar, you'll get something like this where it'll give you the whole PDF. So this is an article from a journal. Again, this one does only have one person. A lot of times they really don't have just one person, because several different people from several different modalities will convene together to create the article. I don't really understand DNA, so I might ask somebody who understands DNA to work with me on an article, right? So they're going to have an abstract, right? They're going to have research, where your research, why am I stating this, right? And then they're going to have references. This references Higgs, 1968, and the page number, right? This one, Stamfus, 1942. Markovitz, 1932 to 1933, right? And so this is peer reviewed. This is going to be a peer reviewed, right? So here on the bottom of this, do you see this? It says expert from M144, lithics past and present. This is going to be basically a book on lithics, and it's going to be an archaeological book on lithics. And then you see the ISBN. This is a library thing, right? This is the date of the edition of the book that is dealing with that this expert's from, right? So you're going to on something that is uh, vetted, something that it has been gone through a journal, been vetted by sources, or not by sources, vetted by people to actually accredit it. You're going to see that it's going to have a lot of references within it. You can on onion sites, absolutely. That's why you need to look at the sources, right? So this one has several different sources. So we went to that last article, and that last article gave us a source. So we took that source and we put it into another area so that we could pull up the article that that source was from, right? The source article. So an article that has several different sources, an article that it can be very hard for us these days to really determine what is real and what is not, right? It's very hard today. So space it is going to have several different sources. A space sometimes you can even go and google, is this site actually an accredited site? Is it actually a decent site? Is archaeology.org actually a decent accredited site? Yes, it is. Is the Onion actually a decent accredited site? No, it's satire, right? So a lot of times you can go and Google that and find out, whether or not that site itself. The one that I showed you, the science.org, right? So if I wanted to know if science.org is actually a decent scientific journal, I might go to Google and go, who is science.org? Are they accredited? What is science.org? And you're going to find basically evaluations, right? Basically, there's going to be people that state, yes, science.org is absolutely an accredited journal site. And you're going to find people that state, no, the Onion is absolutely a satire site, right? So if you're questioning whether or not the journal or whether or not the publication that the article is published in is an accredited one or is a valuable one, you can go and Google that sometimes, right? Um, who funded the research is a huge one. That's a little bit harder to find sometimes, right? Also, just because somebody got their funding from somebody who might be problematic doesn't mean that the person who did the article is problematic, right? So if somebody can only get funding from, the government's problematic. That doesn't mean that the archaeologist who is getting their funding from the government is problematic. They might actually be working on a uh, very ethical basis, right? We also have to understand that everybody has bias. Everybody on this planet has bias. Bias is natural to us. Bias teaches us. Bias gives us the ability to be able to judge, and judgment is good. We should judge whether or not somebody is healthy for us, right? Whether or not something we're judging whether or not a scientific journal is a good scientific journal or not, right? We should make those judgment calls. Bias gives us the basis to make those judgment calls. There's not a problem with having bias. There's an absolute problem with having a hidden bias or a bias for, like, if your bias is European and ultra white, you really should not be publishing articles on indigenous peoples, right? Because your bias is the wrong bias. If your bias is indigenous, then maybe you should be publishing articles on indigenous thought process because your bias correlates with the subject. Your knowledge correlates with the subject because a bias is based on knowledge, right? My biases are based on what I've learned, and so my bias being based on what I learned means that when I am communicating things, that bias affects how I communicate those things. And that bias, how do I put that? That bias that affects how I see, right? My bias affects how I see. My bias affects my understanding. And so if my bias comes from a space of understanding of the subject, then that is a subject that I should speak on because my bias is a space of understanding, right? Bias does. It informs everything. And we like to think, well, it needs to be unbiased. It's impossible to be unbiased. Everything on this planet is biased. right? Everything is about bias because again, bias is about knowledge, right? It is. It's cognitive. It's about, understanding, right? Social factors do have a lot of impact. Indoctrination, especially today, and education also have a lot of impact. Another thing that, especially today, really has a lot of impact on bias is social media and different factors within it, like TV used to have a lot of bias. I mean, social media has a little bit more bias than TV does now. Um, Most people think of different cultures completely based on a TV show that they watched, right? And so their bias is informed by somebody else's bias instead of being informed by the actual thought process, right? So our bias is really affected by everything about it or everything around us, right? Um, it's important to when you're trying to judge whether or not you should listen to somebody's bias because anything anybody says really has a basis in their bias. For me, it's important to look at whether or not people are transparent and whether or not people can change their minds, right? If new information is introduced, do they hear? Do they understand maybe or quest more? And are they willing to adapt their bias based on new information, right? So for me, those things are important, right? For me, I'll tell you, and I say this frequently, I don't know everything. I'm not trying to know everything. This is not a big brain, can only hold so much information. It's got a lot of fucking information already. Only so many penguins fit on this iceberg, as my radiography professor used to teach, right? As the person who taught me physics used to teach, only so many penguins can fit on your iceberg, right? If your iceberg gets too full, some of the penguins have to slip off, right? So, and I am educated in specific areas, but even in those specific areas that I am educated in, information changes, right? So, especially in some of the areas that I am educated in, anthropology and archaeology within the last 5 years has gone through some seriously significant changes in our understanding of our species. So, what I knew 2 years ago, I know today is completely incorrect. There are things that I knew 6 months ago. I would have told you that all species speciate out of isolation and adaptation. And I've said that in here 1,000 times. Speciation comes from isolation and adaptation, or adaptation within isolation. I have stated this 100 times. And 2 months ago, we went, ha ha ha, we speciated through convergence. So now I have to go, speciation for us doesn't come from adaptation and isolation. Speciation from us came from convergence, right? So we have to kind of shift this, right? Shift this. I think the most radical change in our understanding really is the information that we have on the Naledi, that Naledi had cave art and burial of their dead and was carrying fire. And then I think for me, one of the really, really, really big ones has been the finding of wooden structures in Homo heidelbergensis at 500,000 years ago. That is going to severely shift our understanding of how we're doing things, because this is a species that predates us. It's one of our ancestral species. This is 200,000 years before we come onto the scene. We're building wooden structures, and it's Lincoln logs. They're calling it a road, but I personally think Lincoln logs build a log cabin. That might be my 1970s, 1980s childhood, but Lincoln logs build a cabin, not a road, right? So when we're looking at things like that, we see this significant change in our understanding of who humanity is. So, speciation through convergence, Naledi burying their dead and having cave art, and finding the Lincoln. Have a great one, Sleepy. Finding Lincoln log buildings, basically by Homo heidelbergensis. I think to me are I think to me are the really significant advancements that are really changing our understanding within archaeology and anthropology. For me, some of these things I kind of already believed in. I kind of already knew. Like I was telling people a long time ago that, we were building houses before we think we were building houses. I personally think that Homo erectus was probably building some form of structure, because I do not believe that you're going to leave your warm, safe cave and go over 100 miles to another place without knowing that there's going to be a warm, safe place there, unless you have a place to sleep every night, right? The Neanderthal flute is very interesting. The writing, finding that we were writing it 27,000 years ago, that's extremely interesting. There are just a lot of different, and again, for me, some of these things didn't shift my understanding because my understanding, I grew up indigenous. My first memories is elders teaching stories, right? My first memory is listening to an elder tell the seventh fire prophecy. That is literally my first memory, right? So my brain has been saying we're doing this shit for a lot longer. People talk about ancient aliens, and I'm like, that's not ancient aliens. That's just us. We were always more advanced than we like to think that we were, right? So within that, some of these things are confirmation for me, like the fact that there's now looking at a southern boat route to Turtle Island and to Abayala, right? I've always known that there was a southern boat route to Abayala and Turtle Island because I can remember people talking 40 years ago, 30 years ago about coming here on boats. So I've always known that. That's just confirmation of things that I've always known. But for me, the significant changes is the ideas that we speciated through convergence. And it's not that it changes my understanding of us, but the finding of the wooden buildings really just, yeah. And the Letty for me was just like, oh. And the Letty, if you do not know, the Cave of Bones, Unknown Cave of Bones, is on Netflix, and this is Lee Berger, who is the head anthropologist on who is the head anthropologist on the Homo naledi site, right? He's the head anthropologist working on it, and he heads the documentary Cave of Bones. So the artwork that we see within Cave of Bones is there are some places. So there's a hashtag. So the hashtag seems to be our oldest art. We see that not only within the Ledi, but we see it at 100,000 years ago within Neanderthal. And it's the first carvings on caves that we see within Neanderthals and within Homo sapiens, right? Convergence, so meeting together, ping pong. So our speciation through convergence means that several different species are intermixing to create us. So no, invasion is not really coming into play. So the violent stuff, well, violence is around 5,000 years ago, but it's not really that. What it is skin color is based on adaptation to a region. So even here in Turtle Island, we see that in the extremely northern latitudes, you're going to find lighter skin. And the equatorial regions, you're going to find darker skin, even in Turtle Island and Abiyala. You see within Asia that you can see in the extremely northern latitudes, people are lighter of skin, and in the extremely southern latitudes, people are darker of skin. We can see light of skin to dark of skin in Africa. Africa is an extremely huge continent that goes through several different equatorial regions. And so within Eurasia, within Europe, what we're seeing is that adaptation to space is happening. And again, the adaptation to space isn't the skin adaptation isn't as necessary as the eye adaptation. So we do see the eye adaptation first. Yet the skin adaptation does become necessary. We get periods of time. So at 10,000 years ago, we really just left the final little ice age that we had. So this is a time when there's not a lot of sun in Eurasia. So it's absolutely possible that that actually is an environmental factor that drove that start of that shift in skin tone, right? We can see that really it is the equatorial region and where how much sunlight a region gets that dictates the skin tone within different areas, right? Did you see that new article stuff coming across Jedi where they're stating that Neanderthal is absolutely as intelligent as Homo sapien is? The new information states that Neanderthal is no less intelligent than Homo sapiens, that they are as intelligent as we are. Again, I think so. Again, when we're adapting and it takes 100 generations, that doesn't mean very light to very dark in 100 generations. It means, or very dark to very light in 100 generation. It means dark to dark. And then this shade of dark to this shade of dark. And then this shade of dark to this shade of kind of getting lighter. And then this shade of kind of getting lighter to kind of getting lighter. So within each of those, Nikki, the light skin allele within Homo sapien is not the Neanderthal light skin allele. They're two different light skin alleles, so it is not necessarily the intermixing. Now, that doesn't mean that we actually have a light skin allele for Neanderthal within us, but it is a distinct allele for Neanderthal and for Homo sapien. So, like I have the dark skin allele for Neanderthal because Neanderthals were also dark skinned, and the light skin allele for Homo sapien within my genetics, right? So, those are two distinct different alleles because they're from two distinctly different species, right? Exactly. So if we're not getting our skin tone from them, then we're not getting our skin tone from intermixing, right? Um, true. Europeans actually have not a lot of Neanderthal DNA. The majority of Neanderthal DNA is found in Asia. Europeans have between 1 and 2%, which is the same as the most of Africa. Most of Africa has between 1 and 2%. Prior to colonization of Africa, has between 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA, with the exception of the Kwe population of South Africa and the Yoruba population of West Africa, who have 3 ghost species in them. They're the only 2 peoples on the entire planet that don't have Neanderthal within them, though. So Europeans and most of Africa have 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. It is true. Like, got the articles that prove it. And the first Europeans were. Okay, Nick, you can just continue to repeat negative. It doesn't change fact. It's just you running your mouth. So it really has to do with adaptation in space, right? I'm going to go ahead and go in a few minutes, right? We're going to go ahead and go over something before I go, though. I try and end all of my lives on this, and it's important to me. It's part of the reason why I'm here. There's 2 different, so the Kwe, which we hear of as the Khoisan, that is a slur for them. The Kwe population of South Africa and the Yoruba population of West Africa have 3 ghost species in them. Turtle Island Indigenous people have a ghost species, and Australian Indigenous people also have a ghost species. Those 2 populations, those 2 communities are the only communities within Africa that don't have Neanderthal DNA. Everybody else, including highly melanated groups within Africa, have Neanderthal DNA. And this comes because Neanderthal and Homo sapien mix in the Levant area for 100,000 years. And sapien travels back into Africa, and Neanderthal travels back into Europe, and they carry those genetics from that mixing into their spaces as they travel, right? So, I think Turtle Island Indigenous people are like 1% Neanderthal DNA. They're actually pretty low in their percentage of Neanderthal DNA. But I can't remember the exact number. It could be, maybe it's a little bit higher, but I can't remember the exact number in Turtle Island Indigenous people. We didn't really talk about biology and who we are biologically as a species, because because we really didn't go into paleoanthropology as much today. But I want to touch on that just a little bit first before I leave. As a species, we are biologically innately nurturing and communal. And why do I say this? I say this because we are the only species on the planet that has mandatory midwifery, which means that we must have assistance giving birth to our children. This is because of the way that the child is shaped. Their head goes forward to back in one way, and the shoulders go side to side. Then the way that the pelvic outlet is shaped when they're female. So we need somebody to help turn our child as they're being born, and we need help with our child being born. We're the only species that has to do this. The only other species that ever did was Neanderthal. We're also the only species that has ever had 5 life stages from neonate to adult. Currently, those 5 life stages from neonate to adult, well, that's kind of cool. Those 5 life stages from neonate to adult encompass 25 years. Our brain becomes fully formed at 25 years old. That doesn't mean that we stop developing. It just means that it's fully formed. So because of that, bonobos are the next longest. It's 8 years from neonate to adult. Elephants are 5 years from neonate to adult. Our species literally takes 2 years to learn how to walk and 10 years to be semi self sufficient, right? So, because of this, we have an extended period where the children within our species need to be nurtured. And you can't just do that as a singular person. You must have help doing that. Even today, a single mother cannot, or a single father cannot nurture a child from neonate to adulthood without having help. You might have somebody that babysits your kids. Well, you go to work. It's the boss that, that's a part of your community, and your coworkers are helping you, and the person that's babysitting is helping you, and the people that are picking the vegetables, and the people that are raising the meat, and then the people that are transporting that all to the grocery store. This is all community that is helping you raise your child from neonate to adult even today. If we're looking at 30,000 years ago, 40, 50, 100, 500,000 years ago, we need at least a community of 30 to raise a child from neonate to adult. This is because you need at least 10 people to go hunting to protect you while you're hunting and to ensure that you bring home game. Even if you're out gathering things like for making baskets or fruit and berries, fruit and berries, nuts and berries, you still need several different people so that you can watch for predators, so that you can make sure you're safe. And even with all of that, you still need somebody at home taking care of the infant, taking care of the toddler, keeping the fire going. You need people who are making tools. You need people who are making clothing. It takes roughly 30 people to raise a child from neonate to adult of all sexes. Again, there are three: male, female, and intersex. So, because of this, we as a species require nurture and we require community. Now, we know we require nurture because of studies done in the 50s where they put orphans in two different rooms. And one of the sets of orphans they nurtured, and the other set of orphans they didn't. And that set of orphans had failure to thrive and died. We know that we need nurture, and we know that we can need community. And we currently live in a society that teaches you that nurturing each other and being communal is bad. There's something wrong with it. You shouldn't feed the homeless. You shouldn't take care of each other. Men aren't supposed to nurture their children. And because we live in a society that teaches us that nurturing is bad and then communal is bad, and we are innately nurturing and communal, many of us are dealing with a lot of depression and a lot of anxiety. Many of us believe that we're the problem. Many of us are having an extremely hard time living in a society that is extremely unhealthy. This is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. We having depression, having anxiety, having these feelings of disconnect, having these feelings of issue, it is not because we're the problem. It is because we live in an unhealthy society and we are having a healthy response. So, if you're dealing with a lot of depression, if you're dealing with a lot of anxiety, if you feel that this just isn't right, that this is not how it's supposed to be, you're waking up. You're a part of the solution. You are not the problem. You are not the problem. Okay. You are having a healthy response to an unhealthy society. It is those of us who can see. It is those of us who are waking up. It is those of us who are understanding, who are going to be able to make these changes within society. They're going to be able to change this extremely unhealthy environment that we live in. A society that teaches us that we should not take care of each other, and a society that isolates us. Isolation is bad for our souls, it's bad for who we are. So you are necessary because it is only those of us who can see. It is only those of us who are waking up that can affect any form of change in society, that can help us move forward. So if you're sitting there and dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety, I would like you to understand that you are needed. You are necessary. We like to think that worth is based on income, that worth is based on what you can be exploited for. Let me repeat that. We like to think that your worth is based on how somebody else can exploit you. Whether it's your significant other exploiting you, whether it's your coworker exploiting you, whether it is your boss exploiting you, whether it's the government exploiting you. We believe that your worth is based on whether or not you're exploitable. And once we're done exploiting you, we toss you in the streets, and then we start othering you as the houseless and make you the problem once you've become unexploitable. Your worth is not based on what you're exploitable for. Your worth is not based on whether or not you can be exploited. Your worth is based on being a human being who is breathing. You contribute to this society and to this world. You contribute to your species simply by being alive. And you contribute to your species in a healthy manner by being alive and being aware. So if you're sitting in a space where you are not dealing well, where you are depressed, where you're anxious, if you've become agoraphobic like I have, if you are feeling unsafe, if you are feeling that this is wrong, you are not the problem. You are, in fact, the solution. You are, in fact, what can save us. You are, in fact, what can move us forward. Take care, Noah. What is the solution? In my mind, from everything I've seen, the solution is land back globally. Returning and tending and governance to Indigenous cultures on a global scale returns tending and governance to an animistic thought process that makes us all just part of the biome that believes in community and believes in nurture. And by returning tending and governance on a global scale, we can not only reverse the issues that we're dealing with in society, we can also reverse the climate destruction that we are causing with monocrop agriculture and with destruction of the world by digging, right? By mining and different things along those lines. It is important as we move forward as a species, as we are working through this, as we are trying to get to a space where we're not committing our own mass extinction, that those of us who are awake, that those of us who are aware are active participants in the change. And that is why those of us who are awake and those of us who are aware are necessary. We are the needed part. Nobody said anything about sending anybody back. That's a white thought process. It's not an Indigenous thought process. Sending people back where they came from is something that white people do. It's not something that Indigenous people do. Right? Indigenous thought process doesn't do that. And returning tending and governance, I have spoke to people from pretty much every nation across the United States, and there's not a single person in a single nation that I've ever spoken to who goes, get them the fuck out. Every single one of them are welcoming. Every single one of them are not looking at kicking people out. I did not say that. I said return tending and governance of space to Indigenous people globally. That doesn't mean you go back where you came from. You're putting words in my mouth. That means that you allow the Indigenous people around you to teach you how to treat the land around you. That means that we return the land to Indigenous plant life, to Indigenous animal life. That does not mean go back where you came from. There's a whole big difference between tending and governance, return to Indigenous people, and get the fuck out. There's a whole big difference. And nobody's saying go back where you came from, right? So when we look at this, I'm not asking you to make steps, right? There are steps that you can make. We talk about them sometimes. What I'm asking you to do is understand that you're worthy just by being here, that you're worthy. I'd have to have a job for them to get me fired. I am a disabled war vet who cannot work because of my military sexual trauma. That's why I TikTok. So I'd have to have a job for them to fire me from anywhere. So I'm Turtle Island Indigenous, but you can take that somewhere else if you like to. So when we are talking about this, we need to understand that you are worthy just by existing. And if you're dealing with the depression and anxiety that the vast majority of us are dealing with, you're dealing with that depression and anxiety because you're actually seeing what's going on and you're seeing the harm and what's going on. And that means that you're necessary to make the changes that we need to in this world to actually get further along as a species. So give yourself grace, right? Give yourself grace and give yourself love today because you are worthy just by existing. You are needed. You are necessary. You don't have to live up to anybody else's standards or ideals. You don't have to be indoctrinated into the society that's trying to kill you. You don't have to be a part of the hate speech. You are necessary and needed just by existence. So give yourself grace. And remember, you're not the problem. You're a part of the solution. Those who cannot see that there's a problem, those who are not depressed and anxious, those who would rather spread hate and disinformation and troll, that's the problem that we're having. Those are the people that have a mental illness. because they lack compassion and empathy, and they should probably see a counselor. But if you are dealing with depression and anxiety, it is because you're having a healthy response to an unhealthy environment, to an unhealthy society. And that alone makes you necessary. And breathing makes you worthy. Being alive, being here, contributing to our species continuation, contributing to the whole, that is what makes you worthy. So please, please give yourself grace today. Remember, you are loved because I love you. You're human. And that's all it takes. You're alive. And that's really all it takes. I don't stop loving somebody until they're extremely hurtful and hateful to the environment around them, right? So you are loved. You are necessary. You are needed. And you are a part of the change that is necessary for our species environment survival. Thank you, Bird. I appreciate that. It took a long time to realize, right? It took a long time. And every time I say these things aloud to every single person, I'm reminding myself as well that just by being here, I am worthy, I am necessary, and I am needed. Just by being awake, right? Just by understanding, right? So it is definitely something that is needed. Turtle Island is an indigenous phrase for North America. It is translated into English. An indigenous phrase for South America is Abya right? These are phrases that are used for North and South America, and I use them so that we have some reclamation of these spaces, right? There are about 5 different terms used for North America and about 5 different terms used for South America. Turtle Island has become a little bit more of a global usage, though it really comes from a few nations along the eastern seaboard. And Abayala is becoming a little bit more of a global thought process, so it probably only comes from a few nations in South America. I'll be back within the next couple of days, right? And we'll talk a little bit more. And we'll talk probably more on some paleoanthropology. I wanted to do European ancestors today pretty much because in the middle of a medical emergency, I never do this. And anybody who's ever been in my lives knows that I never put up my information for payment. But I didn't really want to bring the paleoanthropology into that one because so often that one gets equated with different things, right? So I wanted to make sure. But we'll probably go back into some paleoanthropology, and we'll probably go back into some thought process of global indigeneity, probably tomorrow or the next day. Absolutely. Oh, have so much fun, Kylie. And take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Remember to give grace to each other as well. The grace that you deserve, everybody deserves. And the grace that everybody deserves, you deserve. You are worthy just by breathing. You are worthy just by being here. You are worthy just by being awake. So much love to everybody. Take care tonight. May you have the best of dreams, and may tomorrow be blessed for you. Have so much fun, YouTube. Take so much care, and I'll see you soon. Oh, and CV, if you're still over there, I don't know what the 6% unknown is. I haven't seen anything like that. So I'll do some research into it and see, and maybe come back to you on it.